Okay, so we have about 25, we can go for about 25, 30 minutes with the Q&A. I do want to make, this is a Q&A, so questions, please, no speeches from the floor, because we have a lot of people who would like to talk. So you and then Dan, thank you.
Thank you for your speeches. Given Hamas and Islamic Jihad and those who control the Gaza Strip that fires out hospital windows, that sends ambulances filled with explosives towards Israeli soldiers, who sends groups, squads of 10 Hamas fighters, one with a suicide vest, whose goal is to basically kill an Israeli soldier and drag his body out. A government that siphons off tons of the aid money that it gets for...
Okay, questions?
Yeah, sure, for tunnels and rockets as opposed to buildings. And again, a Fatah is infinitely worse corruption-wise. What should Israel do, and where is the Palestinian outrage against their government who rapes their people?
Is that directed to somebody in particular?
Whoever feels more better suited.
Someone start.
I'll take it.
You take it. Go for it.
So, I don't know. I feel like I've heard that question before, so either well rehearsed or maybe that's salient. But so in terms of these accusations, let me start with first. Israel has made the accusation against Hamas, and not only Hamas, but against Hezbollah as well, that the high toll of civilian casualties is the result of Israel, of these non-state actors shooting and firing and fighting from densely populated areas. There has not been a shred of evidence to show that, aside from Israeli military cartoon sketches. In fact, the reports that have studied this, including Physicians for Human Rights Israel, including the National Lawyers Guild, including Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch, have repeatedly shown that where there are occasional incidences of this type of tactic, it is in fact not systematic, and that the high death toll is a result of Israel's direct and reckless targeting. So that's number one. Now, maybe we should trust somebody like the United Nations or some sort of objective arbiter to actually do those investigations, but Israel has rejected that as well. In fact, the Goldstone Commission, or the Goldstone Report, which was from the Human Rights Council, found very similar results. And now Israel has denied entry to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to actually investigate it. For a country that is bemoaning the condition of Palestinians being supposedly under siege by Hamas, it would seem that in order to share its great blessings of rocket fires and Hellfire precision missiles, it would also welcome human rights observers to verify this, to hold Israel to account. So that's the first.
Okay, next question. Next question. Oh, okay, you want me to answer the responsibility question?
The responsibility of the Palestinians to
In
do...
other words, the government that knows that this will happen to their people, and yet they fire from hospital windows.
Okay, I guess you haven't heard my answer, because there's no evidence of that. Yeah, but I'm happy to share resources with you. Which videos? Made by the IDF? I mean, that's the only one produced by the IDF.
Okay, this isn't, okay, next, stop, stop. Okay.
I have you sort of described what happened and how it happened. I would like to, I guess Rashid would be probably the better person, is why does Israel do this and when do they do it? So the height in terms of the Gaza wars. So my simplest hypothesis is to explain everything from Castle on, is that it's nothing to do with warfare or strategy. It really has to do with the fact that Netanyahu has, to the right of him, has Naftali Bennett and Avignon Lieberman pushing him for elections coming up. And at the same time, there are U.S. elections cycles. And all they try to do is basically start a war when elections are coming. Okay, in other words, it has nothing to do with warfare strategy as much as just pure political thing to start a war, punish as much as possible Palestinians, just to show off who is the toughest.
I actually think that something that Noura said explains why some of these attacks on Gaza take place, which is the fact that in many other parts of Palestine, in the West Bank in particular, most of the West Bank in particular, to a large degree, Israel has, to use a typical counterinsurgency term, pacified the natives. the most vigorous resistance has come from Gaza. And I think that is why these campaigns, if you ask why, that is why. Now the timing, it may be determined by Israeli domestic political considerations. It may be determined by Israeli security considerations. The military deciding that Hamas is too strong and it's time to use their appalling expression, mow the lawn. But I think that the larger picture of why you have this kind of suffering inflicted on civilian populations is explained by what General Eisenkot said. There is an intentional targeting of civilians in order to collectively punish the civilian population as a means of exacting some kind of political price. And that is done in this case because Gaza has always been, as you said correctly, much more vigorous in resisting, going right back to the beginning. That's what I would argue in terms of the broader context.
Okay. I'm going to just repeat the question. The question was, we've heard a lot about the Israeli strategy, but we really almost hear and never really hear much about the Palestinian strategy because of the weaker part. And the question is to have Rashid talk a bit to that. What is that military strategy?
Yeah. The first thing to say is that for the part of the Palestinian leadership which is in Ramallah, there is no military strategy. The Palestinian Authority in Ramallah has explicitly stated that it has renounced violence. It's explicitly stated that it will not resist in a variety of ways, including some nonviolent ways. And so the question actually applies to the armed factions in the Gaza Strip, essentially Hamas and Islamic Jihad, most importantly. I think they have two strategies. One of them is to inflict as much suffering on Israel as possible through the use of rockets when Gaza is attacked. They know, I mean, the numbers that I gave are not unknown, either to the Israeli military or to Hamas commanders. They know that they actually don't have very effective weapons, except in psychological terms. And so the idea is to extract some kind of pain on Israeli society in revenge for the pain that they see as being inflicted on Gaza. The second thing is to draw the Israeli army into Gaza, because most modern mechanized militaries, which depend on the kind of overwhelming firepower I described, are at a disadvantage in hand-to-hand combat in built-up areas. The U.S. Army found that in Fallujah. The Wehrmacht found that in Stalingrad. Any modern military that depends on mechanization and overwhelming firepower is at an enormous disadvantage hand-to-hand in a built-up area. And that is what they succeeded in doing, especially in Shaja'id and in a couple of other areas where the Israeli military tried to penetrate, and ultimately there were heavy casualties among the Israelis. The total number of casualties in the Israeli military were 67 killed and 700-something wounded, which is a very high proportion of wounded to killed because of the extreme effectiveness of Israeli battlefield medicine and remarkable techniques that have been used, even better than the ratio that the U.S. military has achieved. This is one of the highest ratios ever. But it means a lot of soldiers were hit. I mean, 800 Israeli soldiers becoming casualties is a very high number. And I think it's a testament to the fact that somebody in Hamas is planning this kind of strategy whereby the idea is to lure the Israeli army into these built-up areas. And then, now, to answer this gentleman's question, this provokes an Israeli response, which everybody knows since 2008, when General Eisenkot said it, will be disproportionate and will be directed at civilians. But presumably their calculation is, since we're under attack anyway, when they attack us, at least we can make them pay a little bit. Since we're going to be bombarded anyway, since thousands of, hundreds of people are going to be killed anyway, since our civilian infrastructure is going to be targeted anyway. This is not the first time that Israel has knocked out electrical plants. Lebanon is still suffering from electricity shortages from the bombardment of the Zut Mikhail plant in 2006. This happens all the time everywhere. Civilian infrastructure being targeted. Everybody knows that. So it's sort of part of what they see as worthwhile paying. I don't know if Palestinian civilians see it as worthwhile paying. We're going to see. The last thing I would say is something I didn't talk about. The last thing I will say is something I did not talk about, which was who started this. And I think there are three possible arguments. The Israeli argument, of course, is Hamas started this. Some analysts say neither side really wanted this. They stumbled into it, sort of like World War I. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that either the political leadership, for the kind of reasons you said, Netanyahu being outflanked on his right by Lieberman and Naftali Bennett, and the military, for whatever reasons, may have provoked Hamas. They wanted this war, and their crackdown on Hamas, whereby they arrested hundreds of people affiliated with Hamas in the West Bank, and basically did a search and destroy mission through the West Bank, was intended to provoke this. I'm not sure which of those three interpretations is correct.
So if I could say, can I say
You
one
wanna
thing
add something to that?
because I was thinking that, and it's worth pointing out because one of the things is obviously the question of what started. You can keep rolling backwards,
Yeah.
and the question of the kidnapping of the 3 teenagers. One thing that was that obviously came out when the bodies were found is that the IDF had known that they were dead from the get-go, and so one of the things that I think it was Gideon Levy. I think that was who it was, in Haaretz raised, why? Why create a state of emergency? Why do the ticking bomb when you know that these teenagers are dead? And his argument precisely was, once that Hamas-Fatah reconciliation was signed, they needed to
That's a
go
good
in,
point.
and this became the Korean
Can I
Summit.
ask you about the tunnels?
Can I, I think we
Somebody
have to
might
go to
ask that
somebody else.
question.
Maybe later,
Someone
maybe
might-
later
I feel
on.
like I need to go to the back of the room to be fair.
Yes.
Okay,
Especially the
I'm
ones
gonna-
I'm
inside
going to start
Gaza.
backwards, yes.
Especially
You
the
say a
ones
word, I'm
inside
sorry.
Gaza.
I just wanted to add that I actually do think that Israel, Rashid is being very fair of speculating, and I think I would be more risky in saying that I think Israel deliberately provoked this for political considerations in large measure because it had been singled out by the United States as being the reason for the collapse of the ongoing peace process. It was opposed to the unity government then created by Fatah, entered into by Fatah and Hamas. It had now witnessed the US and Iran engaging in rapprochement in ways that is not beneficial to it. And in fact, domestically and internally, Israel was unable to prevent the ascendancy of Reuven Rivlin as the president of the Knesset. So I think for domestic reasons, Israel did provoke this war with Hamas, as Nadia pointed out. The kidnapping of the 3 settler boys, we knew on day 1 they were dead. And yet Israel engaged in Operation Brother's Keeper, a 3-week campaign in the West Bank, throughout the entire time ratcheting up the claim that Hamas was responsible for the kidnappings, again without a shred of evidence. Israel seems to have a lot of luck with this no evidence theory in pursuing its domestic and foreign policy. And so, but Israeli military have confirmed that Hamas had nothing to do with the kidnapping. Israel wanted the war with Hamas. I think what it stumbled into and did not expect is the extent of it. I don't think that it wanted a 53-day campaign with this much casualties, and that was responsive to a domestic polity which has moved increasingly rightward, and which we witnessed in this campaign all out for the genocide of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, and to create a parking lot instead.
In the back, gentleman in the hat.
I have a question of a historical.
You're gonna have to speak up.
Sorry, I have a question of a historical nature. When was it that Arabs became characterized as the natural enemies of the Jewish people? Anybody with a library card can look up, because it's absolutely free, that if you search through the past 2,000 years of history, that it's been Europe that has consistently been the perpetual persecutor of the Jewish people. If you look at the places they've been expelled from, how did that process happen? If you look at, for example, even Zionism. Sorry.
Great.
So,
Thank you. It's just that there are a lot of questions.
when was that actual transference?
Okay. Well, I'm going to take 3 and then,
Really good.
okay. Woman with her hand.
So unfortunately, you talked about the disproportionate.
Just stand up so we can hear you better.
Professor Khalid talked about the disproportionate military efforts on the ground in Gaza, and unfortunately, that's also mirrored in disproportionate number of pro-Israeli journalists in the media. And this also reflects on the nature of the Israeli and Palestinian groups on campus. Colombia
We need a question.
Yeah, like there's a lot of people at Columbia well versed in disseminating pro-Israeli propaganda, and there are very few Palestinian undergraduates there to answer their questions. And so having said that, how do you think we can objectively educate the Columbia community about the Palestinian cause while avoiding loud arguments and hostility and, you know, discussions like the one just happened?
Thank you. I think we should try not to name call the question. In the back.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit about the demands of the Palestinian resistance during this latest massacre on Gaza, the current terms of the quote-unquote ceasefire, and why none of those why none of the terms of the resistance were met?
So one to both, and we'll take a few more. Okay, one small comment.
I'm from J Street. I'm just asking you, Professor. You mentioned that the unity government is not very strong right now, and that we should focus on BDS and sanctions right now. Besides that, do you believe there is anything? If there is someone we should reach out to for negotiations in Israel, and the U.S. and Israel reaching out to, or if there is no partner right now, or if it's BDS and sanctions are the main policy right now?
Okay. Well, I'll try to answer a couple. So, I'm saying that the unity government is not strong. That although it exists on paper, it's not clear that it's actually going to flesh out any meaningful modes of cooperation and coexistence beyond the technical government that's been established. And so the hope that we have that this unity government will be the first step towards some sort of national Palestinian rehabilitation that not only represents the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, but comes to represent Palestinians everywhere, that is a tremendous hope with very little to encourage that. We'd have to take a huge leap of faith in order to have that. That's not to diminish their role as negotiating partners. I don't think that that's actually a consideration. Israel has considered repeatedly, has said that Hamas is not a partner for peace, but before Hamas won electoral elections, it also said that Abu Mazen wasn't a partner for peace. And before it said that Abu Mazen wasn't a partner for peace, who's now their darling, they also said that Yasser Arafat was not a partner for peace. So I don't think that that's the issue, what's going on internally. My reference to BDS and sanctions was not to say that that's the only way forward. To the contrary, I said, and I'm trying to say, that while that is what we all have a responsibility to engage in, because of the failure of diplomacy and because of the failure of our international mechanisms to work properly, that would otherwise hold a rogue state to account, like Israel, for its war crimes and its severe and systematic transgressions of international law, that it's incumbent on civil society to take that call in solidarity with the Palestinians to push for accountability based on 3 rights-based demands, but that is insufficient as well. And that's not the only tactic that could be used. The other tactics are obviously what's happening on college campuses, and I guess I'll respond to that as well as legal campaigns. Taking Israel to the ICC is necessary but insufficient, because that's not going to be the panacea to actually fulfill and redress Palestinian claims. In fact, going to the ICC is going to open up an entirely new can of worms, something that we didn't discuss here, and let me touch on it briefly. The question of proportionality is not the proportionality between the rocket fire between Hamas and Israel, but a proportionality in reference to what a belligerent force needs to do in order to achieve its military advantage. So in this case, was Israel's attack on the Gaza Strip proportionate to the military advantage it achieved? We don't know, because it's all based on military sources that are not to be disclosed to us. But from what is publicly known, that Israel wanted to destroy the tunnels, not until July 15th, by the way, that Israel wants to diminish Hamas's stores of weapons, that it wanted to diminish Hamas's capabilities at all, right? Up now, on August 26th, Hamas remains in force, is bolstered politically and militarily, and so accordingly, Israel has not even achieved its most broad military advantage, which puts into question whether the level of carnage was actually proportionate. And I pose that as a proportionate, as a rhetorical question. If this was to go to some sort of a court of law, this question would become even more esoteric, because rather than examine the proportionality of the campaign, the court would instead, or the judges and the prosecutor of the ICC would instead investigate the proportionality of each military campaign, of each missile, of each one-ton bomb. And so here what we do is we diffuse the situation and we make it so discreet as to lose the forest through the trees. And not only would the prosecutor do that vis-a-vis Israel's investigation, it would do the same versus Hamas's use of military force. And so we would have a parity that's established that's absolutely absurd. And so anyway, I guess I'll leave the rest to you on the student campus.
Okay, well, we have 4 questions. Very quickly, when did Arabs come to be described as enemies of Jews? Essentially and entirely, I would say, as a result of the rise and success of Zionism and the creation of a majority Jewish state in a country that was majority Arab at the expense of its majority population. So when you do that, you create animosity. You kick out 750,000 people, their neighbors and relatives are going to feel aggrieved. So that's where the process really starts, to answer the first question. Let me very quickly speak to this question of demands of the Palestinian resistance in terms of the ceasefire that were asked over here. These actually became universal Palestinian demands. And it is a little sad to me to see that they were essentially restricted to the reestablishment of the conditions that were supposed to have been created in Gaza as a result of agreements already signed by Israel, going back many, many years. There's supposed to be a seaport. There's supposed to be an airport. There's supposed to be free passage to the West Bank. There's supposed to be movement in and out of Israel of goods and people. And there's supposed to be movement in and out of Egypt into the Gaza Strip. So I think one of the sad things about this war is that the demands, not just of Hamas, these became the demands of the entire Palestinian delegation representing the entire spectrum of Palestinian politics, was reduced to things that they should have had by right, by treaty, by agreement, previous agreement, none of which it seems are going to be implemented. So that is that. And so instead of talking about what I think are the basic problems, if you say, what should Israel do? Well, Israel should not just stop besieging Gaza in violation of international law. It should end the occupation. What should Israel do? It should stop and roll back settlements. What should Israel do? It should stop trying to squeeze the Arab population, the 1/3 of the population of Jerusalem who are Arabs, out of their homes, depriving them of rights and turning this into a city in which only one people is supreme, sovereign, and has rights. What should Israel do? It should address the legitimate complaints about its own citizens, 20% of whom feel systematically discriminated against by the laws of the state and the practices and budgets of the state. What should it do? It should address the refugee problem. I mean, this is what it should do. It's not a question of how should it bomb Gaza? Why is there resistance? There's resistance because there's occupation. Legitimate resistance or illegitimate, as you pointed out. Some of it, I would argue, is in violation of international law. But that's not the real issue, in my view anyway. Yeah, how do you deal with education on campuses? Well, you attend all the events that there are. You organize events of your own. You do your best to make people more aware. There is massive ignorance of many important aspects of this subject. A lot of people are taken on what I would call magical mystery tours of the Holy Land, where they're shown precisely what is desired for them to know. So go off that beaten path if you're on a birthright trip or something, and actually spend 5 days in the Old City and 3 days in the West Bank. You can't get into Gaza. And you'll suddenly find that everything you were told is a complete and utter lie, and that the reality is something completely. Go through Harandia. That's all you have to do. Go through one checkpoint with ordinary people, with your American passport. So, those are the kinds of things that I think would completely enlighten everybody. And you don't have to go to Palestine. You don't have to visit Israel and go off the beaten path. You can do many other things to self-educate. Mercifully, we are no longer restricted to the mainstream media. We're no longer restricted to corporations whose ownership will not allow certain points of view to be aired or published. We have multiple sources of information, and everybody under the age of 25 or 30 doesn't believe anything on CNN or Fox anyway. and doesn't watch them and doesn't have a television. Everybody gets their sources from their material
And
from.
knows how to run power.
Oh, and knows how to run power.
I'm like you.
Except for
I
me.
can't.
So that's the good news.
Okay, gentleman in the white shirt.
Hi. So I have questions, basically. First of all, so we were talking about 67, how they occupied land of 67. I want to take us just back a bit. So 48, how it all started, as I know, and Mr. Rikat referred to it as 67% of the Arabs were the majority of Israel. And as I know, the Israeli state agreed on dividing the country, giving a bigger part to Israel. So why does this situation occur if the Palestinian got a proposition of getting a country? That's the first question. The second question is, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was established in '64, declaring liberation through armed struggle. But that was '64. So why 67 is the big issue? If it's 64, they declared the armed struggle.
Okay.
Just the last question.
There's so many questions.
Okay.
By the way, I want to say one thing. I know we're running over. There are a lot of questions. I'm going to take a few more. If you need to leave, just don't worry. Just person standing in the back, and then I'll take some. Oh, I was going. Go ahead. We're not.
Is it fair to assume from what both of you have said that we should be more than pessimistic, even with the last statement by Professor Khalidi, that we should be more than pessimistic that there will be anything other than the kind of conflict, chaos, and destruction that we have witnessed heretofore?
I'm going to go to this side.
The question is, the U.S. government that has been trying to convince the world that for so many years has been trying to be a peace broker, playing a major role in making these assaults possible and encouraged and reward these kinds of inhuman atrocities possible, should be held responsible for providing latest military equipment and monetary rewards. Shouldn't we say, instead of saying what should Israel do, shouldn't we also pose the question, what should the U.S. do to stop encouraging and...
I'm going to take one more.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could touch upon...
Use your voice.
I'm wondering if you could touch upon 3 UN-confirmed incidents of rockets, Hamas storing rockets in UNRWA schools.
Storing rockets, you're saying?
Right, legitimate military target.
Right.
As well as if you could answer the question of if you think that Hamas, an internationally designated terrorist organization, actually accurately represents the will of the Palestinian people if they represent the people.
Okay, we're going to answer those 4, and then I'll decide whether we're going to take more questions.